Hello and welcome to Virtual Investor Conferences. On behalf of OTC Markets, we are very pleased you have joined us for our Life Sciences Investor Forum. Our next presentation of the day is from Sigyn Therapeutics. Please note, you may submit questions for the presenter in the box to the left of the slides. You can also view a company's availability for a one-on-one meeting by clicking Book a Meeting in the top toolbar. At this point, I'm very pleased to welcome Jim Joyce, Chief Executive Officer and Inventor of Sigyn Therapeutics, which trades on the OTCQB venture market under the symbol SIGY. Welcome back, Jim.
Greg, I appreciate the introduction. It's nice to be here to give a presentation. Before I get started, I encourage everybody to view our forward-looking statements, which we make available on our website, SigynTherapeutics.com. With that said, today we are introducing Sigyn cardiodialysis. This is a first industry device to address cardiovascular disease, which is the leading cause of deaths globally. In terms of how we define cardiodialysis, the objective is very similar to that of kidney dialysis, which is used to extend the lives of those with end-stage renal disease. In this case, the objective of cardiodialysis is to extend the lives of individuals with progressive cardiovascular disease. Mechanistically, cardiodialysis simultaneously reduces the bloodstream presence of lipoproteins that transport cholesterol in concert with reducing the circulating presence of inflammatory molecules that drive cardiovascular disease progression. And it is deployed, and this is a key factor in broad-scale commercialization. It's deployed on the same dialysis machine infrastructure that currently extends the lives of those with end-stage renal disease. Something about cardiovascular disease, again, the leading cause of death worldwide, responsible for nearly 1/3 of annual fatalities. The gold standard for treating cardiovascular disease is called a reduction of major adverse cardiovascular events. The acronym is MACE. This is the primary endpoint of most all cardiovascular disease therapies. The market for MACE reduction therapies is estimated at 150 to 200 billion per year. Notable therapies to reduce MACE, most people are familiar with statins such as Lipitor, Crestor, Zocor, that target the reduction of low-density lipoprotein C, LDL-C. This is the leading class of drugs to treat cardiovascular disease, and the ability of these drugs, as demonstrated in clinical studies, to reduce major adverse cardiovascular events is 25 to 35% reductions in these types of events. Whereas lipoprotein apheresis, which is a medical device technology that reduces the presence of not just LDL-C, but also lipoprotein A, which is currently beyond the reach of drugs to treat cardiovascular disease. The use of lipoprotein apheresis, of which there are approved products from Canica, the liposorber, and from Fresenius, the Dali and Monet systems. These systems have demonstrated the ability to reduce MACE, or major adverse cardiovascular events, by 55 to 98%. Against statins, 25 to 35% reductions in MACE, lipoprotein apheresis, 55 to 98% reductions in MACE. One of the first questions people would ask is, how come we haven't heard of this and why isn't it more prevalent? The fact is lipoprotein apheresis treatments are limited to specialized apheresis centers. And in the United States, the liposorber, which is an FDA-approved product, is limited. Access to the liposorber is limited to less than 60 locations in the United States. So in that regard, I want to talk about Sigyn cardiodialysis. This is an emerging strategy to reduce MACE. It simultaneously targets LDL-C and LPA, which are proven clinically to reduce major adverse cardiovascular events in progressive cardiovascular disease individuals. And simultaneously, it reduces the circulating presence of inflammatory molecules that drive cardiovascular disease progression. And unlike lipoprotein apheresis, the access to these types of therapies will not be limited. We designed Sigyn cardiodialysis to be delivered or deployed on dialysis machines that are already located in approximately 7,500 dialysis clinics in the United States alone. There are approximately 200,000 dialysis machines already up and operating in those clinics. This is an emerging strategy, again, to reduce major adverse cardiovascular events and to discuss the rationale or additional rationale of why we think this can be beneficial to patients. Our therapy is highly efficient. It's able to process the entire bloodstream approximately 15 times during a 4-hour treatment. From an efficiency standpoint, this is processing the bloodstream approximately 3 to 4 times faster than lipoprotein apheresis. Additionally, it has an immense capacity to capture cardiovascular disease targets. Within our device, we incorporate a formulation of adsorbent components that have over 200,000 square meters of surface area to remove our cardiovascular disease targets. To give this some perspective, that's approximately 50 acres of capture area in each device. And as it's now football season again, I will point out that the average U.S. football field is 1.32 acres. So hopefully that will provide you some perspective of the efficiency of our device and the immense capacity it has to remove our cardiovascular disease targets. We believe we have an opportunity to transform the dialysis industry, which today is facing some headwinds with the evolution of GLP-1 weight loss drugs. These drugs are reducing or slowing down the progression of diabetes, which is a #1 feeder of patients into the dialysis clinics. And it's also demonstrating in published reports the ability to reduce the progression of kidney disease, which again creates a headwind for the dialysis industry long term. Additionally, there's the emergence of xenotransplantation. These are genetically engineered kidneys that analysts believe will be available in the coming years to allow for patients, greater populations of patients to be able to receive kidney transplants, which is what is required to get a patient off of dialysis. Today, only a small percentage of dialysis patients ever obtain access to transplantable kidneys before they die. And it's an unfortunate reality. With the emergence of genetically engineered xenotransplantation kidneys, there's a chance to increase the transplantation of kidneys that will get people off of dialysis. So again, I just point these out as potential headwinds facing the dialysis industry. We believe that extending the lives of the dialysis industry's current ESRD patients has quantifiable value, and we'll document and demonstrate that in just a minute. Cardiodialysis also establishes a pathway to treat cardiovascular disease in the general population, which I should point out is the primary focal point of lipoprotein apheresis. Lipoprotein apheresis was not designed to treat or extend the lives of patients that have end-stage renal disease or on dialysis. And we envision today's dialysis clinics as being renal and cardiodialysis treatment centers in the future. And that may be a bold statement coming from a CEO of a company whose market cap is currently around $6 million. But we believe, based on our experience in the industry and based on our interactions with the dialysis industry, that this has the possibility to be a reality. In terms of cardiovascular disease and end-stage renal disease patients, there's approximately 550,000 end-stage renal disease patients who receive approximately 85 million dialysis treatments in the United States each year. Annual mortality rate is 20%, so that's easy math. Once somebody is on dialysis and they're dependent on dialysis for survival, that means the average lifespan on average is approximately 5 years. And you would think that kidney failure would be the leading cause of death in dialysis patients, but in fact, cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of end-stage renal disease patient deaths. And a primary driver of this is that during dialysis treatment, these patients have a immune response to their dialysis treatment that causes a burst of endotoxemia. These are bacterial toxins that translocate from the gut into the bloodstream, which are major drivers of inflammation, and in fact, a major underlying factor in sepsis. And so you have endotoxemia, and you have concurrent inflammation, the excess production of a broad spectrum of pro-inflammatory cytokines that accelerate cardiovascular disease in this patient population. And in concert with this elevated inflammation that is induced by dialysis itself, this also increases the production of lipoprotein, cardiovascular transporting lipoproteins such as LPA. And interestingly, this not only increases the production of cardiovascular disease lipoproteins, the presence of those lipoproteins further induces inflammation. So it's a continuous loop of inflammation in these patients that needs to be addressed. In the industry, at least here in the United States, two companies dominate the industry, Fresenius and DaVita. Between the two of them, they have a 75% market share. I mentioned earlier about the value of extending their lives. Based on the size of the patient populations of Fresenius and DaVita, the patients in their networks, each month of extended life of the patients in their network would add $1 billion in additional revenues to each company, again, for just 1 month of extended life. If you could extend the life of these patients by 6 months, analysts will have to quickly rewrite all of their projections in terms of value going forward in the future. These patients are also very health compromised. Dialysis patients oftentimes suffer from a wide range of conditions, in many cases driven by the inflammatory response of their dialysis, but they spend considerable amount of time in the hospital. And so we can also calculate that reduced hospitalizations can also recoup revenues for these companies. And so consider that when the patient is not going to the dialysis clinic and they're in the hospital, they're out of network, and Fresenius and DaVita loses money. So for each week of reduced hospitalization, that would allow for approximately $250 million in recouped revenues to Fresenius and DaVita each. Now, our clinical plan is based on an investigational device exemption that we've drafted for FDA submission. This is based on the enrollment of 12 to 15 end-stage renal disease patients at 3 site locations. A feasibility study, so that you know, is the equivalent of a safety study. Our device is a Class 3 medical device, which means we have to demonstrate safety, and then we have to demonstrate efficacy through a pivotal study. Our device is not a biological agent. It does not incorporate unapproved biological agents, so it is not subject to the clinical studies of drug agents, which you know is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Our product is subject to a feasibility study to demonstrate safety, that our device is well tolerated in individuals, and then a pivotal study that's required for patient approval. In our study, and this is a really cool clinical study design because it allows us to not only demonstrate safety, but it allows us to capture data that would help us effectively design our pivotal study. So in our study, Sigyn cardiodialysis will be administered in series with regularly scheduled dialysis treatments. So nothing changes for the patient. They're already going to be sitting in their dialysis seat 3 times a week for 4 hours of treatment. And what we do in the first week of treatment, this is a 6-treatment protocol. In the first week of treatment, we're quantifying changes in blood chemistry as a result of their dialysis alone, just so we can understand the impact of dialysis on reducing pro-inflammatory cytokine levels, on reducing endotoxin, on reducing LPA or LDL-C. We want to demonstrate what is known in response to dialysis by itself when these patients receive their therapy. And we would expect to see, in some cases, especially with inflammatory, significant spikes of those factors occurring as a result of dialysis. And then in week 2, which is treatments 4 through 6, we include Sigyn cardiodialysis in series with the patient's dialysis cartridge. And then we again measure or quantify through blood analysis the ability to reduce LDL-C, LPA, endotoxin, and a battery of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And our hope would be, our hope and expectation would be that we see during single treatments alone considerable reductions of all of those targets. So the primary endpoint is safety. Secondary endpoints are LDL-C and LPA reduction, and then the quantification of endotoxin and inflammatory cytokine levels. The completion of this study would set the stage for a pivotal study in the end-stage renal disease patient population, and it would establish a potential pathway to initiate cardiovascular disease studies in the general population being individuals that are not on dialysis, individuals without end-stage renal disease. So in that regard, I would pose the following question, and maybe this is a question for an analyst, but if we can demonstrate the safety of our device, if we can effectively advance it to extend the lives of end-stage renal disease patients, if we can then leverage that to advance our product into treating the general population of individuals with cardiovascular disease, which is the #1 cause of death worldwide, how would that be valued? So in closing, today we're introducing you to Sigyn cardiodialysis. This is the first in industry device to address cardiovascular disease, which is a leading cause of global deaths. And with that said, I will open up the floor for Q&A. If you need to contact me, at the bottom left-hand corner of this slide is my email address. For those listening and don't see the slide, email address is just the letters jj@sigyntherapeutics.com. Now give me a second here and let me pull up some of the questions. First question is, what is the estimated market size for therapies aimed at reducing major adverse cardiovascular events? At present, the market is quantified specifically for reducing MACE. Therapies to reduce MACE are estimated to be, the market for those therapies is estimated to be between $150 to $200 billion per year. And today, that market is primarily comprised of drug therapies, and will continue to be the case, in the coming years until there's a progression of cardiodialysis devices in the marketplace. I will point out, this gives me an opportunity to point out something that I didn't previously really emphasize, that from a long-term perspective, cardiodialysis currently and in the future addresses circulating therapeutic targets that are beyond the reach of drugs. In the treatment of cardiovascular disease, statins, primarily are addressing LDL-C, single mechanisms of action drugs. The opportunity with a properly designed extracorporeal blood purification device is that it can not only target the known factors that improve patient benefit, but it can also target the factors that are known to cause cardiovascular disease progression, that are currently beyond the reach of drugs and may always be beyond the reach of drugs. And I think you should also recognize that this is not a static industry where we know what all of the targets are. There's going to be a continued emergence of new targets that are related to cardiovascular disease that are naturally driven based on diet, based on genetics. But I think you'll also see in the future that it'll be better understood that in some individuals, cardiovascular disease can be induced by environmental contaminants. And I think this will be a new field where, again, therapies that can reduce the circulating presence of those targets will have a significant advantage and be of immense value to people that suffer from cardiovascular disease. Next question is, how might extending ESRD patient lives and reducing hospitalizations financially impact dialysis clinic operators and the broader healthcare system? It's hard for me to speak to the broader healthcare system. There's too many moving pieces for me to have an appropriate, educated response. But we do know that reducing hospitalizations allows the dialysis industry, specifically Fresenius and DaVita, to recoup revenues by keeping their patients out of the hospital. That's a significant impact alone. As I mentioned, each week of reducing hospitalization is worth about $250 million to each Fresenius and DaVita. How will they financially impact dialysis clinic operators? The main reason it'll impact them is to keep the patients in their seats. Each month that these patients continue to survive, based on a current average survival, length of time of 5 years, extending the lives of these patients by a month, 6 months, a year, multiple years, that will have a significant financial impact on the dialysis industry. And it should really provide, from the perspective of a small company trying to execute on a strategy to build value for its shareholders. We believe that one of the best ways to do that is to create therapies that provide strategic advantages to an established industry such as the dialysis industry. And I have a long history of being involved in developing extracorporeal blood purification technologies to treat infectious disease, oncology, and I will tell you, historically in our space, we oftentimes create devices that are life-saving, but they haven't always driven extreme value, for shareholders, based on the fact that they didn't provide strategic value to an established industry. And the focal point of our company at Sigyn Therapeutics, first and foremost, is to make sure that our products, starting with Sigyn cardiodialysis, that they are designed not just to extend life or to provide patient benefit, but they are designed to provide a strategic competitive advantage within an established industry, in this case being the dialysis industry. And we know quite well the two primary players in this space. And at this point, our focus is executing on our clinical plan. And if we're correct in our assessment, then we should be of strategic value to these companies. Next question, when will Sigyn submit its IDE for the feasibility study, and how long would a study last? The answer to that is that we fortunately have already drafted a feasibility study that only requires us to modify some of our clinical endpoints, including the addition of LPA and LDLC. So the document is essentially drafted. We've already identified clinical sites. We need to get the sign off from principal investigators and our collaborators at these clinical sites. And then we'll send that document over to FDA, specifically the Centers for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, which oversees our devices. And my experience in working with the colleagues at CDRH, of which I've been involved in a number of programs with them, is that they will look at our IDE, they will respond thoughtfully. There's not going to be an automatic clearance, say, Jim, go ahead and get started. There's going to be at least one round of comments, and I would suspect that we'll have our IDE in place to be filed at the very beginning of the year. And then we would expect to have clearance by the middle of next year to initiate our clinical studies. In terms of timelines, it's hard to put timelines on how long a study will take, but this again is targeting a 12 to 15 patient enrollment at 3 clinical sites. And at these dialysis centers, the ESRD patients, generally at least 50% of them are likely to qualify for our inclusion criteria. So the study should be efficient in its ability to enroll patients and complete our study, and then subsequently create a data set to send back to FDA that would allow for us to potentially have discussions regarding a pivotal study that could lead to product approval. Next question is, how could successful clinical results pave the way for cardiodialysis to be administered to the general cardiovascular disease population beyond ESRD patients? Well, I think ESRD patients are a great place to start. These patients are already captive in the dialysis clinics. They already have blood access, and they have accelerated cardiovascular disease based on the treatment methodology that they receive 3 times a week for 4 hours of treatment. So they're a very good patient population to start with. But long term, the objective is clearly to move into the mainstream population. And so one of the questions that we ask in an analysis is, well, will patients go to a dialysis center to receive these therapies? I mean, we're targeting multiple targets that are beyond the reach of drugs, plus LDLC, which is addressed with drugs. So the question is, will people with cardiovascular disease take the time to go into a clinic and commit to doing that on a regular basis for an extended period of time? And we believe they will. There's the factor of the convenience of having a single target drug versus the effectiveness of a device that can address multiple targets that play a critical role in cardiovascular disease progression. So that really is the big question: is will people do that? And with established lipoprotein apheresis devices, there's not been a great ability for people to demonstrate that they would go into a clinic on a regular basis based on the very few clinics that offer that type of therapy. But we look at the FDA approved product to reduce LPA and LDLC, the liposorber, and it's available at less than 60 clinics in the US, but the company represents that, there's been over 600,000 treatments administered to about 6,000 patients, which, easy math would say, well, that's approximately 100 treatments per individual. So people have demonstrated that they will go into the clinic to receive these therapies. So it's going to be driven by individuals that one, an increased level of confidence if we can effectively demonstrate the capability to reduce the progression of cardiovascular disease, to reduce MACE, which is the primary clinical endpoint. And I'll also point out that we're at a point in time in our industry where people are very interested in healthy lifespans. And there have been, news stories about wealthy individuals going into therapeutic apheresis centers to have their plasma exchanged to reduce the circulating presence of things that are accumulating in their blood as a means to extend their life in general. And I don't know if there's a point in time where those thoughts will intersect, but I will say that therapeutic apheresis to exchange plasma to reduce the circulating presence of accumulating targets that people are pursuing is highly inefficient as compared to what we're doing. Our technology does not require any replacement fluids, such as replacing all of the plasma. It's just efficient at removing targets. And if we can address the inflammation that underlies cardiovascular disease, that may impact other types of chronic conditions as well. We know inflammation underlies, not just cardiovascular disease, but neurological disorders and other conditions that can be life-threatening over time. Question, is Sigyn therapy being evaluated for other inflammatory or infectious indications beyond cardiovascular disease? The answer is yes. And this is a great question because the answer poses the scenario of a young company that has to make decisions on its pathway forward. And we think based on the size of the market opportunity, the long-term benefit for patients, the ability to transition beyond ESRD patients into the mainstream market, we believe that, and also the proven precedent that reduction of LPA and LDL-C in the bloodstream, this is a proven precedent that demonstrates consistently a reduction in major adverse cardiovascular events. So we have that working for us. But the mechanism of our device, the ability to address bacterial toxins such as endotoxin that translocate from the gut into the bloodstream and create life-threatening, inflammatory responses, the ability to address excessive production of pro-inflammatory cytokines. These are the primary driving factors underlying sepsis, which is the leading cause of death in U.S. hospitals. But try to envision, in the absence of a FDA-approved precedent, it's very difficult to envision the ability to design a pivotal clinical study. It's unknown until you get there, and it could be expensive and take years, whereas with cardiovascular disease, it's the ultimate market opportunity. We have significant advantages over drugs in terms of the breadth of therapeutic targets we can address, but we also recognize that these capabilities can establish the use of our device in a major indication, but also recognize the potential application for our device in other indications. So sepsis, I pointed out, we have colleagues at a company called Spectral Medical that's advancing a device that solely addresses endotoxin removal. This is a leading candidate to be approved for treating sepsis, a medical device that reduces endotoxin, driving a market cap of over $400 million right now. So we know there is value there. Should they demonstrate endotoxin removal is beneficial to patients, that should be very valuable for us. If you looked at COVID-19, and again, I'm just pointing out other inflammatory, or the question was, is it being evaluated? Is our technology being evaluated for other inflammatory or infectious disease indications beyond cardiovascular disease? I will point out we've collected data related to the ability to reduce the circulating presence of viral pathogens from human blood plasma, in addition to the inflammatory cytokines whose excess production are induced by viral infections. And I will point out that during COVID-19, the first 4 therapies approved by FDA under FDA emergency use authorization prior to any antiviral drug or prior to any vaccine, the first 4 approved therapies were blood purification therapies, 3 of which were designed to reduce inflammatory cytokine levels, and 1 of which was designed to reduce the circulating presence of the virus itself. In our case, we have a device that can demonstrate the reduction of both of those targets. So again, beyond our cardiovascular disease focus, there is other opportunities, but that's not our current focus. And as it relates to an emerging pandemic threat, I will point out I previously oversaw the first device approved by FDA to treat an emerging pandemic threat. And that was a device that was approved to treat Ebola and had a remarkable outcome in treating a physician infected with Ebola. That was broadly published, and the device is very well known within industry. So I appreciate that question, but our primary focus from driving our business and having an executable clinical strategy, we believe that best, those opportunities best correlate with the advancement of our device to treat cardiovascular disease. Bear with me. Let me see if we have any other questions. Next question, what milestones should investors watch for in the next 6 to 18 months? Submission of our IDE to FDA, initiation of our study in end-stage renal disease patients. We think those are significant values. As the timeline that was requested is 6 to 18 months, the completion of our feasibility study, we think would be a significant value driver, especially as it relates to this being a Class 3 medical device for which there's a feasibility study and then a pivotal study required for approval. So I don't project valuations, but I would envision a device that has moved beyond the feasibility study, that's moving into a pivotal study for approval in the cardiovascular disease, which is the world's #1 cause of death. I would have to think that was a value driving milestone. In the backdrop, something I have not mentioned at all, but something that we think long-term will drive value in a different way, are the technologies that we filed patents on advancing related to improving the delivery of chemotherapy, related to improving the delivery of immunotherapeutic antibodies. And chemotherapy, most commonly delivered drug to treat cancer, immunotherapeutic antibodies, top selling drugs to treat cancer. I'll just quickly point out that if you dig into the literature, you'll note that typically less than 3% of those drugs actually get delivered to their intended targets. And in both cases, there are serious concentrations of circulating particles that decoy or sequester the delivery of those drugs. And we believe there are mechanisms, specific mechanisms that you can reduce the circulating presence substantially of those decoys prior to the subsequent administration of chemotherapy or immunotherapeutic antibodies. And those are not programs that we intend today to advance ourself. Our focus is on advancing Sigyn cardiodialysis, but those are programs that we envision advancing through joint venture development relationships. And by doing so, what we're hoping to do from an accounting standpoint is to create assets that beef up our balance sheet considerably, in addition to advancing therapies that could have a big impact on improving the benefit of chemotherapy and immunotherapeutic antibodies. Next question, how many shares of Sigyn are outstanding? If price rises, do you anticipate forward stock splits? I can't project stock splits at this point in time, and have been doing this long enough not to project changes in price or anything of that nature. But the answer to the question is we have approximately 1.7 million shares outstanding. And we've been very fortunate to have shareholders that are core foundation shareholders that have been very supportive of our endeavors going forward and have allowed us to get to a point where we have not created dilution or diluted out our shareholders. And believe me, it hasn't been easy. But the fact is we've seen industry colleagues over the last 3 years in the current market environment, and I've seen many different types of markets, but over the last 2 or 3 years, the investment banking industry, bankers that are known to be top placement agents consistently for micro cap and small cap companies, the majority of the financings have been structured financings that have wiped out the core shareholders of many companies. And I've watched this happen to industry colleagues that have good companies, good product candidates, but yet value has just been wiped out. So it's been difficult to avoid going down that path, but the market conditions are changing. We now have our position to execute forward. And I'm proud that, I'm very fortunate to have supportive sharebholders, but I'm also proud that during a very putrid would be the best term for the investment banking industry for microcap companies. I'm proud that we haven't created excessive dilution to our core shareholders that have been critical to the development of our technology. Question, how does cardiodialysis simultaneously reduce both cholesterol transporting lipoproteins and inflammatory molecules to address cardiovascular disease? Good question. Our product, as I mentioned during the presentation, it incorporates a formulation of adsorbent components. And by doing so, we have components that are able to remove or sequester therapeutic targets from the bloodstream in different size ranges. We have adsorbent components that are very effective in absorbing things below 15 nanometers in size. We have adsorbent components that are effective in reducing things below 50 nanometers in size. And then we have adsorbent component that is able to remove much larger molecules. And then there's the mechanism of our device, which is uniquely efficient from the standpoint that we don't require, and this was one of the problems with lipoprotein apheresis. Lipoprotein apheresis first had to require plasma to be separated away from blood cells and then circulated into a device that could then reduce the targets that it was going after, and then reconvening the plasma, with blood cells, and then combining those and then returning those to the patient. In our device, it's blood in, it's blood out. But it is unique in the standpoint that we rely on a scientific phenomenon called Starling flow, So when blood flows into our device, it flows at a certain blood rate that creates a pressure differential. And in our device, there's 3,900 fibers that all have porous walls. The average size of the pores on the walls of our fibers is about 200 nanometers. And as blood flows into the device, there's a pressure differential that drives the plasma and our therapeutic targets into what we call the extra lumen space, which is the space outside of the fiber walls and inside of the shell of the cartridge. And in that space is where we incorporate our adsorbent components. And what we think is, brilliant about this design, quite honestly, is that we all of a sudden have our therapeutic targets interacting with adsorbents in a very low shear force environment where the opportunity to remove those targets is then optimized. And then the part of this phenomenon that's known as Starling flow corresponds where there's a equal pressure differential at the back end of our fibers, but it's a reverse pressure differential that pulls the plasma out of the extra lumen space back through the fiber walls and then reconvenes it into the bloodstream. So it's one device, it eliminates multiple moving pieces, and more importantly, it's designed based on the size of the device, the number of the fibers, the lengths of the fibers to create the ultimate blood flow for performance. That design allows it to operate at blood flow rates that correspond with those of dialysis, which is why the device can be used on the global infrastructure of dialysis machines already located in hospitals and clinics. And as I mentioned, here in the United States, there are 7,500 clinics, not like protein apheresis, which is available at 60 locations. There's approximately 200,000 dialysis machines located at 7,500 clinics in the United States. Next question. And by the way, I thank everybody for these questions. They're excellent questions and they seem to be very thoughtful. Next question. Are there partnership or acquisition opportunities under consideration to accelerate growth or reduce risk? My answer to that question is we're focused on initiating our feasibility study and completing our feasibility study. And that's specific to Sigyn cardiodialysis. And any discussions that we have related to partnerships, acquisitions at that point, those will, we're going to initiate and complete this study. And those outcomes will really determine, what types of potential partnerships will be there and the potential value of those partnerships. And the demonstration our product is safe, well tolerated, and that it can remove the targets, from the bloodstream, that it reduces their circulating levels during treatment. Those questions being answered will drive value for our shareholders, but will also increase the opportunity for partnerships or acquisition opportunities. But until then, we know that's the trigger point. We can have discussions, but still those discussions end up coming to the same conclusion. Let's run the study, get the data, demonstrate it's safe. And I'm highly confident, based on my previous industry experience, that it will be demonstrated to be safe. And I'm highly confident that we will effectively remove the targets that we're going after. And I think it's a synergistic combination of targets that we're going after, because the inflammatory factors, bacterial toxins that translocate from the gut into the bloodstream, excess production of a battery of pro-inflammatory cytokines, those factors drive an increased prevalence of cholesterol transporting lipoproteins such as LDLC and LPA. The presence of LDLC and LPA in the bloodstream increases inflammation. So it's a very synergistic direction that we're heading to treat these cardiovascular patients. So I have a lot of confidence in what we're doing. We still have a lot of work. We have to execute on our strategy. But I believe if we complete this feasibility study and have the outcomes that are possible, I think we can then discuss partnership or acquisition opportunities. I will also mention, and by the way, I'm taking advantage of the fact that there's no presenter after me, so I'm not barging into anybody else's time. But I will add this idea or this question of partnership or acquisition opportunities. If you were to study the history of extracorporeal blood purification technologies outside of mainstream dialysis, you would recognize that companies whose products weren't acquired or where there wasn't a significant partnership, even if those products were approved, even if they demonstrated the ability to be life-saving products. And again, this goes back to being of strategic value, having a product that changes the business model of an established company, creates a strategic advantage. That's critically important. But I will say historically, something that we recognize is our industry colleagues that weren't acquired or didn't have major partnerships, they didn't fare too well on manufacturing and marketing products on their own. So we're very cognizant of that history in our industry. All right, with that, it looks like I've answered all the questions, I believe. I really appreciate everyone's time today. And again, if you need to reach out to me, my email address is the letters jj@sigyntherapeutics.com. Again, thank you for your time. I know we went over considerably, but I do appreciate your interest, and I hope you follow our company. And more importantly, I hope you become a shareholder and we develop a long-term relationship together. Take care, and thanks again.